Should have been recording since the start, but got what you got. So you'll see this over on Moodle week 5. And so we're going to introduce Exodus and then talk about the name of Yahweh. We might get to this more on Thursday, but again, that's at least a goal. And so the basic structure for the book of Exodus comes to us in 2 parts. One of them is a specific departure from Egypt, which we call the Exodus. And the second half, or not more than half, the second part, because it's much more than a half, but the second part is the journey and arrival to Mount Sinai. Journey and arrival to Mount Sinai that you have within that chunk from 16 to 40 in Exodus, that you have the specific teachings, which we refer to as part of it as the 10 Commandments or the 10 words. And we'll talk about that. And then you have the setting up the building of the tabernacle at Mount Sinai. So the kind of specific requirements that Yahweh has for this dwelling place for him to be in as he's gathered together with the people. Again, you should start hearing notes of Abrahamic covenant starting to be fulfilled. There's this mass of people, Abraham's great grandbabies, all of them, that are now gathered, while not necessarily in a place, but God being present with them. So again, we start to see the seedlings kind of come forth from the ground, and we start to see how God, again, is working towards that end of making happen what he had promised to Abraham. And so within the first section of 1 through 15 in Exodus, you have the prelude, which does a lot to set up what is happening in the Exodus. And we're going to spend some time here because it's important for us to recognize, again, against the contrast of what is happening in Genesis, where God is always around, he's talking, he's provided, he's given Abraham kids, he's given Isaac kids, he's given Jacob a ton of kids. And despite what has happened between Joseph and his brothers, we have a new situation in Egypt that has to be addressed. And that's what the prelude will get at. It's a lot like, I haven't seen it yet, but for those of you guys that are watching WandaVision, like you kind of need to watch those first parts in order to understand the rest. Like you kind of just got to trudge through it a little bit in order to set up the rest of the story. That's what's happening with these 6 chapters, that if we don't really get a hold of what's happening here, the rest of the story we can go ahead and just kind of turn into a fancy Disney movie and have a great soundtrack that wins a bunch of awards. So again, we need to understand that part. And let me get those next 2 sections. So with the plague specifically, and we'll talk about that when we get there, most likely next week. But the plagues, hopefully we read this a little bit differently, especially against the context that we now understand as what is a part of the ancient Near East, the specific elements that were present in the Egyptian cosmogonies, as far as it goes, again, with Pharaoh having magic, that there was, again, different deities that resided in specific places that likewise use magic in order to accomplish their will. And then again, what that means when Yahweh comes on the scene in order to deliver his people, which happens in 13 through 15. And so the second part of Exodus, the Mount Sinai, focusing on law and teaching. Again, that the reason why it's split there is the same reason I brought up at the start of this class. So when we think of law, we have to think Torah, which means teaching. And it can refer to law, but again, we have to change our thinking of what we think about law, not just legal, 40 miles an hour on the streets. To go from that more so into guidance, into a specific way of living and being in relationship with this God. Again, prescriptions for how to be in relationship with this new God. And so, that being said, it's probably not necessarily a new God as much as it is a new relationship with this God that's made himself known to the ancestors. But I didn't want to clarify that and also to correct it. So with Mount Sinai, you have that journey to Sinai, the people moving towards this mountain, and the actual giving of the 10 Commandments there in 19 and 20. The reason why it's 10 words, it's 10 Commandments, but the Hebrew literally is 10 words or 10 sayings. Then you have the Book of the Covenant. Again, the contents are what are a part of the deal. Again, relationships without expectations are chaos. Relationships without expectations are chaos, especially committed relationships. And so what covenant does is it sets the parameters for the content of the relationship and how it will get lived out. And what is Israel saying yes to? What are they committing themselves to? So after having committed themselves, and likewise Yahweh committed himself to the people, and the people committing themselves to Yahweh, the tabernacle then will kind of put a bow on the whole thing, despite this kind of rebellion and forgiveness in the middle of it. You have the instructions for creating the tabernacle, the space where God will dwell. Again, the Israelites don't. This might sound cruel, but it comes across as a grace, especially for people that were once enslaved, that they don't have to just make it up for themselves, but that rather Yahweh guides them on how to build the place that He's going to be with them. And so again, that it functions as a kind of grace, that they don't have to just kind of reach in the dark for something, hoping that they're going to please God, but rather, again, Yahweh gives them. He partners with them in the creation of a place for both of them to be together. Contrasted with Pharaoh, who only wants constructions and buildings built for himself. He doesn't want partnership, he just wants buildings for himself. And so then the tabernacle gets built. And we'll talk about this some more, especially with tabernacle. Again, because if we lose what is happening there, then it could just seem like a lot of dry literature where it's just people making another building for God, and that's not what's happening. Especially in a relational context, where it's God. The reason why this thing is going up, so God can be with the people. That the buildings or these little, not even buildings, these structures exist for the purposes of relationship, not just to have structures in and of themselves. It's not just legalistic code. So that being said, there's a few things that I do want to talk about with covenant and law specifically. That in a context of slavery and deliverance, that deliverance from slavery is the basis on which the law or Torah is given. What I mean by that is that the people aren't obligated to be obedient for their deliverance. The people are delivered solely on the basis of God hearing their cries from oppression. They're not performing obediently in order to get their deliverance. They haven't chalked up enough points or enough tickets to cash in, and now guess what? You've got enough grace in your tank to where I can bail you out. That's not what's happening here. That grace precedes law. Grace precedes law. And that's really, again, really important for us to understand, because that's what we've seen so far is the kind of, and what we'll see more so with the Exodus is something thematically that we've already been talking about, specifically with grace and judgment. Grace on one side and judge, while not withholding judgment on the other, and what that looks like depends on what side you're on. And so again, grace for the Hebrews looks like judgment for the Egyptians. But again, it's a grace given not because of performance, but because of God's hearing the people crying out from their oppression. And out of this, the Exodus event will shape every part of life for the Hebrews. That history becomes ethics. In recognizing what God's done will shape the way and the character of the way people ought to live. And as we'll discover shortly, especially when we talk about the plagues, and this is important to remember for the plagues, the issue is ownership of the land, which resulted in the issue of worship. Ownership of the land results in issue of worship. Especially in the ancient world, if you control the resources, it's very likely you also control the worship. You control the religious atmosphere. It's been true historically then. It's been true historically, Latin America, and Asian countries that have experienced colonization as well. that again, the relationship between ownership of land and the issue of worship comes up in Exodus. And again, we'll talk about this, especially when we talk through some of the challenges that Pharaoh poses to Yahweh. And so does somebody want to read this in Exodus 1? Don't be shy.
I'll do it.
Do it.
The total number of people born to Jacob was 70. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers, and that whole generation. But the Israelites were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase in the event of war, join our enemies, and fight against us and escape from the land."
Thank you, Nicole. There's a few things that I want to pick up for us. Again, if we read through this introduction too quickly, we can miss it. Notice that Joseph is already in Egypt, that the assumption is, hey, Genesis to Exodus has been combined as one story, that, again, that it makes sense to put these things together. It's not two separate instances. Notice some of the language, and I want us to think back. Other places, again, knowing that Genesis and Exodus are linked together. The whole generation of Israelites were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. What does this sound like? Fruitful, prolific, multiplied, growing, exceedingly strong. The land being filled with them. What other place in the Bible thus far, not just generally Old Testament, New Testament, but where specifically between the books which we've read so far in this class, specifically biblical? It's really only been one, so. Fruitful, multiplied, grew exceedingly.
We saw that with Adam and Eve, and with Noah, with honestly, it feels like I read that like in almost every story.
Yep. Chances are when you will see this very much when there's a new thing occurring. That God does something new, there's a whole lot of babies on the scene. Beautiful little babies running around everywhere. But again, what Exodus is trying to communicate to us is not only this repeated theme calling back to creation, but also that, again, the Abrahamic covenant is happening. It's happening. That this call for humanity to be fruitful and multiply in the earth in Genesis 1:26-28, that created in God's image, and then given the command, be fruitful and multiply in the earth. After, especially post Genesis 6, that we start to see specifically for Israel, the people that God had covenanted with through Abraham, being fruitful and prolific in a land not their own. To the point to where now they're starting to freak some people out. That this new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And it's important to recognize here, this did not know Joseph. If we were in class, I'd be writing on the board and stuff like that, but can't. Who did not know Joseph. That did not know phrase is really important, because this will kick off so many of the events that happen in the chapters that are coming, specifically in regards to oppression. That it's a king who did not have relationship with Joseph. A king who did not have relationship with Joseph. And so also, because of that, go ahead.
I've read that this was also technically a whole nother dynasty than the one Joseph knew, because I believe it's common belief that the Egyptians at the time of Moses were actually the Hyksos. I think that's what they're called.
Hyksos, yeah.
They're basically a tribe that had invaded Egypt and took over for a period.
Yeah, and it's possible. It just depends on when do you date the Exodus story. That there's two possible dates for the Exodus, either in 1400 or 1200. But I think irrespective of the time period in which you put it in, what it's trying to be communicated is that the causes for their oppression will be related to a loss of relationship. specifically in regards to Joseph, who was number 2 in the land, which then was the strongest empire in the world. And so, again, to see that the situation for the Israelites has changed, and what that's caused specifically for those in power is a kind of fear in them, specifically in regards to their being overthrown because there's so many of them. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase. In the event of war, join our enemies and escape us and escape from the land. So, which makes you think, why not just treat the people better? But that's not usually how power thinks. So the oppression. So again, that Israelites are fruitful and multiply while they're in Egypt. It's not that while they're in the land, it's not while they're at home, but rather that they're fruitful and multiply while they're in Egypt, a land not their own. And so again, that's why at the start of this is kind of an aside. That's why at the start of the class I made a note that it's important for us to recognize when these texts are being compiled, because especially for people, if this is being compiled during and after the exile, that what this reminder would have meant for people that are estranged from their homes, have lost family members, lost friends, to read these stories about how God is still with the people despite not having a home. And that they're still living into their vocation despite not being in a place they can recognize. Again, so much of that is exile. And Peter brings it up in the New Testament, calling us foreigners and strangers to this land. Talking about Christians that are now a part of the kingdom of God. And so there's, again, lots of overtones for us to see here some of the connections. But this growth in the people in fulfilling their vocation, part of it at least, of being fruitful and multiplying, causes Pharaoh to grow paranoid, and he fears their partnership with enemies. Again, the desire to want to hold on to power is very much in Pharaoh's interest. And so what does Pharaoh do? He orders state-ordered foreign slave labor rather than native workers. Instead of providing jobs, what he does, he enforces labor amongst the Hebrews. And again, a lot of this is from this loss of relationship between Joseph and Pharaoh. It's again not of Joseph's own doing. It's just he passed away, and whoever had risen into power no longer desired to either honor or observe the relationship that the past leadership had had with Joseph and the people, and thus loss of relationship partnered with a severe fear of this foreign people in the land gives way to oppression, which is really sad. Let me see if I have it here. I do. Oh, I didn't throw this in there. Let me, because this is such an important point. I don't want to go over. I don't want to miss this or go through it too quickly because of how rare we talk about this. I thought I included it, but my bad, y'all. It happens. Okay, let me open this up real quick and so you can see what we're looking at here. All right. Here we go. So now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph, and he said to the people, look, the Israelite people, we already read through this part. So therefore, this is verse 11. Excuse me. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramses, for Pharaoh, but the more they were oppressed, the more they were multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed on them. Again, note some of the language. The taskmaster set to oppress them. The more they were oppressed, the Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks. They made their lives bitter. They were ruthless in all the tasks. So again, this is the way that the language starts building of what is happening before God even enters onto the scene. You have this kind of bitter cruelty that keeps getting ratcheted up more and more and more and more. But again, we can't read through this too quickly or else we miss, again, the kind of repetition that's here. But in the midst of this, verse 15, the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him, but if it is a girl, she shall live. But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, why have you done this and allowed the boys to live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives. And the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live. And so again, I do want to point out how women factor prominently in these kinds of narratives. That what we have here is a kind of civil disobedience in the midst of this cruel oppression. That we have these women who are contrasted with the figure of Pharaoh or the king of Egypt. And I'll talk about the general name given as contrasted with Yahweh, but we'll get there. While these women are saving lives, precious lives, Pharaoh tries to destroy them. And again, embedded within their names are these characters, Shiphrah, whose name means beautiful, and Puah, whose name means a girl. Hey, girl. That you have these women's efforts to save lives go in contradiction to what Pharaoh's orders are. Which makes me want to raise a question, because again, the Old Testament is a wild place. Excuse me. That what can be said about civil disobedience in Yahweh's favor for those who go against the rules? Again, this is not just general based on conspiracy theory or presumption, but on very real activity that is happening and having adverse effects on the most vulnerable, especially these Hebrew children. It wasn't bad enough for them to be oppressed and enslaved. But you know what? Those ladies that are oppressed and enslaved, let's go ahead and get their babies and let's kill them. Again, very real oppression that is happening. So then what can we say about civil disobedience in Yahweh's favor with those who go against the rules? At least, again, specifically in regards to this text. Talk to me. I know it's 9:45. Oh, we're almost awake by now. We're getting there. It's almost 10. That's when everybody's eyes crack open.
Can you repeat the question?
It's this question that's here on the slide, that what can be said about civil disobedience in Yahweh's favor with those who go against the rules? And again, specifically in this text, because what we see is that these women who lie to Pharaoh and preserve lives, that they end up, what is, in the ancient world, is considered a mark of honor, which is to be able to bear children, that Yahweh gave them babies.
I think it goes to show the importance of listening to God, even when maybe it's not a popular opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. My only question is where in the text do we at least see where the women get a command from God not to do it and then they kind of act on it? Because at least you can see somewhere in the text where there's something going on between what the women do and don't feel comfortable with. But I do agree on the not popular thing, because obviously that's going to get them in trouble, and it was largely at risk to their own lives, which is why they obviously had to make up that idea. Is like, yeah, these women, they're quick.
Well, they never like they didn't make it seem like they explicitly like broke the law.
Mhm.
They found a way around it so that they wouldn't be punished and they wouldn't have to, commit murder.
Yeah,
They found the loophole.
there you go. There you go. Anybody outside? Because I do want to give you guys again the opportunity, because we don't oftentimes, at least not in Bible classes, are confronted with these kinds of difficulties of people who subvert the system. Abraham does it with lying to Pharaoh in order to preserve his life and Sarah's. Isaac does it. Jacob does it. Moses is going to do it in a little bit. But here we have these two women. And Nicole said, found the loophole, subverted the system in order to preserve life. What can be said about these kinds of things? We put God first. He never forgets us. By the way, midwives fearing God, they put God first and didn't murder the Hebrew children. God awarded them with families. Yeah, I think there's definitely something going on with they feared God that motivates them towards a kind of action that doesn't just affect themselves and preserves their own life, but rather preserves the lives of the most innocent. That fear leads them towards a kind of action that produces the good of their neighbors, of these children. And I don't think that's necessarily something too small that we can look past. But Josh, go ahead.
I think a difficulty a lot of people have with this passage, and this occurs a couple of times later on as well. Technically, lying is seen as a sin, and yet the lie served a greater good. So I think a lot of times people wrestle with that.
Yeah.
Technically, lying is a sin, but at the same time, well, they were, Nicole. They were saying they had a white little lie to the Pharaoh to say about the Hebrew women. That's not technically what was happening. What they said is not technically what was happening. They were just sparing the kids.
Yeah.
But I mean, probably a more prominent example. We're not going to necessarily cover that, but I think a better example would be what happens with Rahab and the spies Joshua sends. That's not part of Pentateuch, but that's another example of what I mean.
Yeah.
That one, she blatantly lies to keep them safe. So
yeah. But again,
I've had people wrestle with that.
Yeah, but it goes back to the same thing of the preservation of life, even though in Joshua it's quite ironic because it ends up leading to the destruction of some life. But again, there is some thought to God's favor towards those who subvert oppressive systems. Specifically here in Exodus, again, I'm not generalizing the rule to be applied all over the place, but specifically in regards to Exodus of these women who subvert the system, whether we call it a white lie or a blatant, bold-faced lie or kind of finding a loophole, that the kind of subversion of the system. But again, for the purposes of one being motivated by God and this kind of fear that they have, that leads them towards a kind of action that reflects more of God's work in the world than it does Pharaoh, counteracting the death and the culture of death and destructive work that often marks Pharaoh's empire and his rule and reign, which again had already started in chapter 1 with having this kind of fear that is instilled in him by saying that there's too many of them. What if they start making pacts and treaties with their neighbors and they end up ruling us and running us out of here? So you know what we need to do? Let's enslave them, make them work rough. And so again, the way God works to counteract these kinds of actions and activities, looking for willing participants, seemingly to subvert some of the systems that are working against humanity and their ability to live out their vocation as being representatives of God in the world. There's something dehumanizing going on when slavery is not only enforced, but allowed to be perpetuated. And how God uses partners like these in order to subvert some of these systems. And I would fair to say that he still does some of this. Nicole, it looks like you had wanted to say something.
Yeah, could you give the passage reference real quick?
Exodus, let me find it real quick because it was Exodus 1, 15 all the way through to 22. 15 to 22. And so that's why I bring a lot of this stuff up, is because of the areas in which, of course, you can say, well, they didn't have the 10 Commandments yet, so they didn't know any better. But again, the dealing with the text in its context, that the kind of intelligence, resourcefulness that these women demonstrate in order to preserve life, and how God works with them, if nothing else, I think it's worth something wrestling with. And then what does that mean for us today? What does that mean for us today? Again, honoring and taking the text of the Old Testament seriously. And so, Nicole, if you have something, you can always come back to it. But I don't want to, again, move on from this too quickly, just because, again, we don't necessarily talk about it as much. And again, I think this affords us the opportunity to talk about, especially in our day and age, with talk about God being with a specific people or God being with a specific cause. Looking at the Old Testament text and grappling with, okay, well, where is God at work? And what does it seem? If we are to say God is on a specific side, then what is he working towards and who is he working on behalf of? So, all right. Any other thoughts, comments? All right. So our boy Moses. So Moses himself, he's not born by any kind of supernatural announcement or phenomena. Not like Isaac, not like Jacob, where he's got this kind of series of events that happens to him. And I should have it here, but I might not, again, to my demise. Yeah. Jeez. All right. There's something here that I want us to see again in Exodus 2, especially with Moses. That now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. Two characters, we don't have their names. We just know it's a Levite dude, a Levite woman. Verse 2, the woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him 3 months. I can't move past that too quickly. That fine baby, it's not so much that, again, it's a very fine child. He's got a great nose, great set of hair. His fingers are all there. Teeth, not yet, but we'll work on it. That fine baby is Tov. It's a good, pleasing baby. Again, the same word that we have when God looks over creation and he sees that everything is good. He sees that it's Tov. When she saw that he was a Tov baby, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and plastered with bitumen and pitch, and she put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Again, can't move too quick. What other, I don't want to say things, but I don't want to give away either. What other objects were created with a little bit of wood bitumen and pitch. Think back in Genesis.
The ark.
The ark. Hey, there you go. The ark. So again, these notes, if we go by them too quickly, we'll miss it, of how Exodus is trying to recapitulate and recapture some of the events happening of what God is doing, not just in creation in Genesis, but rehearsing some of these things as this new thing God is about to do in light of the oppressive, we can call it the disordered, chaotic context, which is Israel in Egypt at this point. And so what the woman does, again, which is contrasted with what we have happen at the end of the chapter in chapter 1, that Pharaoh orders these babies to be killed by means of throwing them in the river. But it's ironic because what Moses' mom does is put him in the river. But the river becomes the means, the waters become the means by which he is preserved. Because later on we see the daughter of Pharaoh came down to the bathe at the river while her attendants walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child, he was crying, and she took pity on him. Again, this is no small thing that you see these women contrasted with the merciless Pharaoh. And who reflects Yahweh more in the story? These women. This must be one of the Hebrews' children. And she said, then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you? Pharaoh's daughter said, yes. So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, hardest time reading today, take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed it, and the woman being Moses' mom. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. She named him Moses because she said, I drew him out of the water. Beautiful. What I want us to start making these connections and seeing from Genesis how these things tie over, that they'll begin to foreshadow what will happen in the Exodus event. That you have Moses, who's hidden in what we might call an ark, this tiny little baby ark. That Moshe, who comes from the word Mashah, which means to draw out, is called Tov by his mom, which I had already said. But Moses, who is hidden in what is in Hebrew, it's called, or in English, in Exodus 2, it's called a basket. But in Hebrew, it's a tevah, which is, again, the same word used for ark. The Noah is preserved in a giant, massive basket floating on the water, and so is Moses. But what these tevahs do is that they become the means of preservation and provision. And if your mind is running to the New Testament with baptism, great. Great, because there's lots of overtones from this event that we see of how God preserves through water. Now Christ is in part our tevah, the means of preservation and provision. Not saying that he's here, that that's what he is, but again, the means, the symbolism is there. But we know very little about Moses' childhood, other than his tutoring as Pharaoh's kid, which likely would have taught him the language of the Egyptians, as well as knowing Hebrew because he was raised with his mama.
Yeah, I think people often forget Moses did spend a time with his actual mother, or because she was the one who nursed him, so he would have been aware of his heritage culturally.
Yep.
Which again informs what happens later.
Oh yeah, much of
in
it.
his life.
And that's why I wanted to read through that story, because again, here you see the subverting effects of what is happening in the story, because we had seen it with Shifra and Pua and how the system gets subverted in these women by preserving life. Now the system again gets subverted by Moses being taken care of by his mom. Which again, there's a lot to draw on about children being separated from their mother, but to save from time, we see how, again, God brings the two together. And so Pharaoh, Josh, you had brought this up earlier, but there's no definitive answer on who the Pharaoh actually is. If you were to ascribe to one of the Ramses, it's always my time to hammer on the Nacho Libre references. One or two, it's, again, part of it does depend mostly on where do you pin down the Exodus event, whether in 1400 or 1200. And the reason for that is because of some of the archaeological evidence that fits either time period. But the reason why Pharaoh isn't named, fair to say, and this is more partita belief, that would common in the ancient world, you would leave out the names of enemies as a way to shame them. You'd make them a nobody. Who's this guy? Just this dude over here. This dude, this chick, this girl, this guy. That again is just you don't use somebody's name as a way to not just to shame them, but to make them a point of reference that it wasn't even worth knowing their name. And again, in a context where Yahweh is about to reveal his name, that's for me, that's what makes the most sense. Is that when you have Yahweh's name being revealed, again, set against the context where there's contention between Pharaoh and Yahweh, Yahweh's name being left out, to me, it's not arbitrary. Or Pharaoh's name being left out isn't arbitrary, excuse me.
I got a
Josh.
question. How do we know that the Pharaoh from the Exodus was actually building large structures? I know we see that in movies and such, but what gives the indication that that was actually going on? Because I don't recall the Bible mentioning that.
Well, I read it earlier. Let me see. Oh no, that was actually in the slide that I pulled up. So you see that they built cities and structures, and what pharaohs were known to do is that they would construct structures within their cities. Oftentimes, that would be used as points of not validating, but venerating the pharaoh. And so you'd have these structures again built. That you have, therefore, they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramses for Pharaoh. And so the Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks and made their lives bitter hard service. They were ruthless in all the tasks they imposed on him. So again, the building of these supply cities, and what a lot of these were meant to do was to hold excess supplies that either for military or agricultural, and that these were means to be used as to demonstrate power. Yeah. And so, again, it's not so much that they built a giant gold statue for Pharaoh, again, as much as they're doing very, what at least would appear to be common work that would be imposed upon Egyptians. Like, hey, we need construction workers. Okay, we're going to go build a city. But no, it's forcefully pinned onto the Hebrews. Moses' mother named Jochebed. Mm-hmm. So again, so that's why I bring up the stuff with structures and buildings and whatnot. And so it's likely, again, Ramses II, with building these large structures in these cities. It fits the time period. But again, if you don't hold to this, then it's not, your theology and your belief in Jesus isn't going to suffer, depending on which pharaoh you fit it into. Especially against the backdrop of what is the story trying to tell us. But there does seem to be a significant change in Pharaoh, because after the plague, you see this attitude shift. That from a defiant who is Yahweh to a kind of more pacified, okay, get out of here, go worship. And again, these are possibilities within the text. And we'll go ahead and end here before we get to 3. Again, I will talk about the name, but I do want to talk about these two specific events that happen. That you have Moses, who witnesses the sight of another Hebrew slave being beaten, and he cannot tolerate the sight of one of his countrymen being brutally treated, and so he intervenes. But what this demonstrates is a kind of Moses severing himself from his past and a kind of demonstration of solidarity with the Hebrews. And again, that Moses, who knew of an upbringing, one being with his mom, but another one of being in Pharaoh's palace, Pharaoh's household, being Pharaoh's grandson. He's got a lot to lose. But what this does demonstrate for us is Moses is the character of Moses and his personality, both for better and for worse. Because while we see Moses's connection with the vulnerable, the oppressed, you see Moses just wilding out. Moses killed a man, killed a guy. Anybody know what movie that's from? Brick killed a man. Holding a grenade in his hand. Oh, come on, Anchorman. Anchorman. Anyway, that'll be on the quiz. So, Moses is a wanted man, a fugitive. Pharaoh wants his head on a platter. And so what he does, flees, runs off into the wilderness. After killing a guy, Moses runs off into the wilderness. And then at the end of chapter 2, God finally shows up. At the end of chapter 2, after all this stuff has happened, God finally shows up. And I want to read this and then we'll talk about it and be out of here. This is chapter 2, verse 23, that after a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Out of their slavery, their cry for help rose up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them, or God remembered them. And this is really important to recognize because this is the first time God has been mentioned in the first 2 chapters, that with the presence of oppression, Pharaoh building up his empire, children dying, Moses killing a guy and running away. And so again, this is why I had put so much stock in the prelude and understanding what is happening here in order to understand the rest of the story, that you have this groaning under the slavery, the oppression of the Egyptians and crying out. And again, notice the repetition of words, groaning, crying out, their cry, their groaning. That there's something happening here, that it's not just a whimper like, man, this sucks. But no, that they're deep, deep weeping. They're crying out, they're groaning. And this gets God's attention. So then God remembers, and this is really important for us to have in mind, especially as you're reading through the Psalms, where it'll say God remembers, and it's not so much God forgot. He's like, oh yeah, that deal I made with Abraham, crap, like I got to go do something. No, it's more when Yahweh remembers, it's Yahweh about to be prompted to action. It's prompting Yahweh to action. When the psalmist says, God, remember your people, it's Yahweh act on behalf of your people, do something. There's just, again, the vocabulary of it, very much more artistic flair in saying, God, remember your people, and not just God, do something. And then what does God remember? His covenant to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so God's response here, in light of the oppression, for God to hear, God to remember, in this obligation to a prior commitment, he's about to act, and then God sees that God will be moved with compassion and now will begin to move towards these Hebrews, which will mean their freedom. and then God knew, this kind of sharing of experience. And then next class, we'll jump into Exodus 3, talking about God divulging of his name to the Hebrews, how God sees what's happening to the Hebrews and how God is about to act in order to liberate this people. Prince of Egypt movie, even though it's not completely biblical, I think it's a great. Yeah, they have a Prince of Egypt. They have a lot of details to fill in. It's just that's part of the story. They have to fill in an hour and a half, almost 2 hours worth of content. But yeah, the music's great. Music's absolutely. And but I think one of the things they do well is they capture the kind of emotional inflammation that is a part of the characters, especially Pharaoh and then Moses. How he kind of Moses is kind of like he's non-linear. He's not just one dude the whole time, but rather he's more of a dynamic character. And so, again, I'll rehearse this on Thursday, but this is why I wanted to spend more time going through the prelude, because again, all this is going to set up what's happening with the Exodus event. And so much of this, of what this reveals about God's character, that Israel comes to understand, and we understand as a result of reading through the story and learning and asking the questions about who God is in light of this event. Because again, that God who looks upon the Israelites also looked upon us in Jesus, and then calls us to be his people, and how God's made a way from sin, from death, from the principalities and powers of this world, to bring us into the kingdom of his son. And so, are there any questions, comments, concerns? I know we're here at the end of it, and you guys have chapel to go to in a few minutes. Thoughts, comments, questions, concerns? Man, I love me some Exodus. I don't know if you guys can tell or not, but I told you guys at the start of this class, Exodus, my jam, all day talking about Exodus.
There's a very good reason why it's the one book of the Bible people keep making movies about.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Genesis has gotten some play, but who did you say you thought the Pharaoh of Exodus was? Ramses II. Ramses II. It's likely it's Ramses II.
Yeah, he's the most widely accepted
Yeah.
one.
Yeah, it just makes the most sense. But again, if you were to Thutmose, there's other options out there. Is just again where you place the Exodus event kind of lines up with who's Pharaoh at that time. All right. Well, if there are no comments, questions, I will have my office hours today from 2 to 4. If you guys want to come by, hang out, say hi, say what's up, change your backgrounds mid lecture, mid conversation, feel free to do so. But yeah, you guys have an awesome Tuesday. Take a nap today. Drink your water.
Thank
Watch
you.
cat videos.
Thank you. See ya.
You guys.
Thank you. Have a great day.